what I'm going to do is just briefly recap what Mike had talked about with REPRA and how it relates to you in the healthcare industry. Some of the learning objectives that we have today is just to specifically look at hazardous pharmaceutical waste, the risks of noncompliance, and the importance of doing a formulary review, waste map, and to understand the proper disposal and the training requirements. We're going to also go through subpart P as well. I'll do it. Okay, thank you. Who manages waste at your healthcare facility? You've got a lot of people that are around the medicines and that they can generate the waste, but those who have contact with, dispose, or deliver pharmaceuticals must be trained on the proper disposal, and all training must be documented. There are both legal and environmental reasons why you want to have a strong pharmaceutical waste collection program. BRCRA was formed in 1976. At first they focused on manufacturing, but then after that got sorted, they then move into the hospitals. And with BRCRA, the goal is to protect the health and the environment, health of humans and the environment, and to help minimize waste by recycling what you can. They set up requirements under these different regulations for OSHA, DOT, and in Wisconsin, the different regulatory codes that you should comply under. And the consequences for not having a good program is that you can receive a civil penalty that runs from anywhere from $14,000 to $56,000 a day per non-compliance. And then also DOT can fine you, and the person of authority is held accountable. If it's a willful violation, people can actually go to prison. So the mismanagement of waste, as far as the health reasons, when we come there and we go to pick up a red bag and let's say a needle was not put into a sharps container first and it punctures through the bag and hits one of our folks or one of you when you go to take it down there are consequences that come with it because you don't know what's on that needle. You might have hepatitis C or something. So it's important that you understand and your employees that are putting these things in containers know what container to put what item in. Okay, also, as far as hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, recently EPA made changes to say you can no longer flush hazardous waste pharmaceuticals down the drain. They cannot be sewered. So it's important, and that is because they've been able to do studies that show that this transfers into our wastewater. And I don't know if you ever saw that episode of The Simpsons where Marge serves fish to Mr. Burns and the fish has 5 eyes. You know, it's kind of like part of the reason of why they said, okay, let's just make sure that we don't flush hazardous waste pharmaceuticals down the drain. How does this apply to you? Anytime you have a bottle that has a partial medication in it, anytime you have an IV bag that still has medication in it, if you have hand sanitizer, and I'm sure you have much hand sanitizer now after COVID, but maybe you have a half a bottle there and it's due to expire soon. All of these things fall under hazardous waste and hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, and you have to know how to get rid of it. If you have some people that come in to your facility and maybe they were a smoker and they had a vaping device, you know, that liquid nicotine that goes along with there, or if they have a nicotine patch or fentanyl patch, these are all things that you guys probably have to deal with and need to know where it needs to go. Some of that Mike talked about earlier, characteristic waste. If it's a delisted waste, it's going to have any of these characteristics to it: ignitable, corrosive, reactive, or toxic. A lot of the chemo drugs that are in your facility fall under U-listed waste. And some of the P-listed, the highly toxic, acute, hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, will fall under that category. Epinephrine, if you have EpiPens in your facility, the EpiPen itself is mixed with a concentrate that it doesn't qualify under the P waste, but if you just had straight epinephrine, it does. So if you have EpiPens, those can be put in the red bin. Okay. We were talking before about the D and U listed. You might see these names on some of the items that you have in your facility. Those would fall, these toxic drugs would fall under those characteristics. Okay, so here's some program basics for you. At the very beginning, what you need to do is, if you were just starting in your job, you'd probably want to know what waste do we have on site, right? What of those drugs that we have here are delisted? What are P-listed? If you go and work with your pharmacist, they could probably come up with a formulary list for you that would kind of help you. But then you need to go into your maintenance shed and go, what do I have here that might be considered toxic, and take care of those items. You want to then, now that you know what you have, you need to figure out how much waste you have, and that will help you determine what your generator size is, whether you have a small amount or a large amount. And then you also need to be able to develop a waste map so that people within your facility know what to put where when they're dealing with waste. So here's an example of the formulary review that we have. You need to know what it is. If it's an EPA regulated waste, is it controlled waste? If you're dealing with Oxycontin, what do you do with it? Where do your nurses put it? Or if you have a sharp, what's it considered? Is it a regulated medical waste? Bloody gauze, regulated medical waste. How do you dispose of it? You just kind of run this together in a chart. We help many of our facilities pull this together in what we call our green book, where we have a formulary list that goes in there, as well as emergency contacts. So this is something that when Joint Commission comes and wants to do a walk through your facility, you can just pull this out and go, sure, let me show you what my formulary list is. And you can have it here. Let me show you my waste map. It's all right in one place. Okay, we talked before about generator size, and what you have determines what category you are. Well, recently, if you want to go ahead, next slide, Stacy. Recently, the EPA came out with new rules called Subpart P. And it basically says that if you're a small or large quantity generator, you have to fall under these new regulations. If you're a very small quantity generator, you don't. The benefits of being part of Subpart P is when you look at your waste numbers, you can take the whole hazardous waste pharmaceutical number out of that total number for your facility. So you just count your hazardous waste that might be in your maintenance area. So that has helped relieve the regulatory burden for a lot of those small and large quantity generators by not having to keep count of all of their waste. Also, the acute P waste, before it used to have to be that you had to separate out the P waste from all your other black waste, toxic waste, but now you can put it together in one container. If you're a very small quantity generator, you can decide whether to opt in to Subpart P or not. If you don't, then you need to follow your rules as before, where you separate out the waste and you have to keep track of your waste numbers. Okay, satellite container placement. Locations must be in a secure area under your control. That could be in a med room, nurse's station, as long as it's supervised there. You have to determine where your container should be, and one way to do that is to have a map, maybe a blueprint of your facility that shows where in your facility is that container located. We have an example in our next one that shows, in this floor, in this room, you're going to find this container, and that's the size that it's going to be. Okay. For your P listed, you really need to know where those are located. And many facilities often go with just standard sizes in different facilities, or they might have recyclable containers rather than disposable containers for areas that are high traffic areas where they turn them around frequently. They could save some money by doing that. When your container is full, it has to be moved to the main accumulation area within 3 days. And it's important to develop an inspection checklist. It's done on a weekly basis so you can make sure your containers aren't leaking. Here's an example of an inspection log and a checklist that you could have. Okay, waste maps. Those are important for your staff to know what goes in what container. Here's an example of a waste map that's used right above one of our recyclable containers that lets people know what goes in this container. Here's one that says in this black container, no sharps go in that container. Here's an example of a drug buster or a cactus sink that's used. So it lets people know what goes in there, how to dispose of it, and who to call when you need to get it replaced. Just having it all mapped out for people lets them know. Here's an example that I think UW had used of a previous pharmaceutical waste map that shows what container, what goes in each container. Okay, where do pharmaceuticals go? Drugs need to be placed in black containers and they're labeled hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. If you have what's called a dual waste, it's a biohazard waste that's mixed with hazardous waste. An example of this might be someone's going through a chemo treatment and they're just having a bad reaction and they have to take it out quick and blood comes back up through there. The bulk chemo amount that's in that bag is considered hazardous waste. It's more than a trace amount. So that, with the blood in there, causes that to be dual waste. Doesn't happen often, but it happens. With dual waste, it's the most expensive waste that's out there. Do the next one. And because it's most expensive, here's how you have to treat it. You have to put your items in the red bag and then put that inside of a black box, or if you have a purple box or whatever it is that you have, but you have to label it dual waste, because that lets us know that when we send that out for disposal, we can't just send it to a regular incinerator. It has to be one that can take incineration and biohazard waste at the same time. You want to try to avoid making this as possible, but if it does happen, keep it separated and label it dual waste. Okay, for P-listed waste, what's important to remember with this is you can no longer sewer hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So that means triple rinsing of pharmaceutical waste containers no longer needs to happen now. Once you get rid of items, you could just, if you make sure that almost everything is out of it, you could just throw the whole container away in the black bin for acute toxic waste. So if like a Coumadin, warfarin, empty blister packet, the residue from the highly toxic waste needs to go in the black container. And if you're not operating under subpart P, we talked about that before, a very small quantity, you have to keep it separate from your other hazardous drugs. But if you are operating in subpart P, you can put them all in the same container. Chemotherapy waste. Talk just briefly about bulk waste. Bulk is any used chemo drug, anything that's been spilled on with chemo, those go into the black container. For trace chemo, it's anything that was everything was squeezed out of that IV bag, or you had PPE on and it wasn't spilled on, that could go in your yellow bag, or if it was a needle, go into the yellow sharps box. Some other important notes: controlled substances. For many controlled substances, you have to have make it past the DEA regulations that says you have to make it non-retrievable. So that's why those cactus sinks are there. You put it in the cactus sink first to make it non-recoverable, and then once that's done, the Wisconsin DNR would like you then to dispose of it as a hazardous waste afterward. No needles or sharps go into the black bin. If you have IV tubing, you just crimp it and wrap around before placing it in the container. If you have packaging that doesn't have employee information on it, or patient information on it, some people either put it in recycling or they throw it in the trash. And it's important just to remind you to have an emergency response plan for how you're going to dispose of your waste. Non-pharmaceutical hazardous waste, aerosol cans. We talked a little bit about when you have, say, spray paint that has, if it's empty, it can be either recycled or thrown in your trash, depending on what your facility likes to do with these. But if it's not empty, you have to look at the labels, see if there's hazardous waste in there, and dispose of it properly. Hand sanitizer, if your bottle is half full and it's due to expire and you have to get rid of it, rather than dispose of it as a hazardous waste, maybe you can find somebody that you could donate it to, because then when you're donating it, it becomes a product. It's not a waste. So think about that. Maybe employees that might be using hand sanitizer, or you could break it out and put it into other places that are highly used. That way you're going to use it instead of dispose of it. It kind of helps reduce the hazardous waste numbers for your facility too. Remember, cleaners are corrosives in some cases, so really read your labels. Xylene, you probably see that a lot in your facilities, and you need to work on proper disposal for that. Electronics, all part of the universal waste cycle. Make sure you tape your ends of the batteries, the NiCad and lithium batteries. And if you have something you don't know what it is, put it in the hazardous waste room, and our people can come and take a look at it and make sure it gets properly disposed. How do you comply with these rules? First off, you want to make sure that the containers that you do have a UN sticker on it. You want to make sure that your container's lid is closed after disposal. They're going to be free of cracks and stains. A lot of times people use liners too, so if there is any leaking, it can kind of help get contained and not get ingrained into your container there. And you want to disinfect if you're going to put it back into service. And any leftover hazardous waste medications go in this container. The label must be visible. And if you have any empty vials that don't have any patient information, you can just put them in the trash, except if it's chemo. What shouldn't be in your hazardous waste container? We found medical devices in our containers. And you're like, what? How could that happen? Well, it does. So you just want to make sure that the training is done to your staff. Some people say, well, I put it in there because there was a little bit of blood on it. Okay, well, you can make sure that that gets properly disinfected, so $10,000 piece of equipment doesn't end up here. We want to make sure that sharps and biohazard waste are not in the black bin. And empty vials and things, there wasn't anything in them. They could have probably gone just in recycling for you. Okay, you want to make sure for your proper labeling of your container that you have what makes it hazardous. Is it flammable? Is it toxic? Those stickers have to be on your container. And in the past, it was like the most hazardous sticker went toward the top. What's important is that they can't be overlapping. They have to be separated out.
And those numbers need to be 6 inches, or well, we do this, but 6 inches from you. But if you guys did it, it'd be 6 inches from that label.
Yeah. In the area where you keep your hazardous items, you need to have a sign posted on the outside of that facility that lets people know that room lets people know it's a hazardous area. You've got contact numbers that are right there, a fire extinguisher within 75 feet, an eye wash station within 55 feet. It can be portable, but it's important to have that. Have an evacuation map, spill kit, ensure your labels are visible, and you've got to have to date the container when the first item went inside in that main accumulation area in there. So you have a container that you're bringing from a satellite area down to the main area. That's when that gets dated, when it's down there. But you got to keep your disposal date top of mind. So having a logbook either in your binder that you could use for weekly inspections, or having a sheet on your room that lets people know when this is, that's probably an important thing to do. So these are some common inspection issues if they were to take place that you can easily fix now so they won't be an issue later. Make sure you have an idea of your waste determinations, what you have on site. Formulary review will help you do that. Make sure your labeling is done correctly. You're not sewering hazardous waste, and you're properly disposing your chemo waste. And if you're at training, today we're going to give you a certificate that shows you've gone through completion of training. But if you're training other people, just have their name, what you talked about, and then have them date and sign it, and then keep that record so you could show it. Other things, weekly inspections, those are important. Make sure your containers aren't leaking. You got to make sure you keep track of your manifests. With us, we have manifests that we keep on file for you for your biohazard waste for 3 years or 7 years that we keep electronically on file. Hazardous waste, they're eventually moving to electronic, but right now it's very paper driven, but you'll need to have those. Improper management of expired pharmaceuticals. It's important to know you're not putting a hazardous waste in a blue and white non-hazardous container. If you're not sure, always go up with hazardous, always dispose of hazardous, because then that's like the most stringent way you can go, so you can't go wrong with that. But you can go wrong if you put hazardous in a non-hazardous container. Your main accumulation area does not have a label and containers are not dated. That's probably one of the biggest ones that we see that happening. Okay, overview of the state and federal regulations was subpart P. There were 3 main changes that happened. One was the generator improvements law, subpart P, and the nationwide sewer ban, as well as for nicotine amendment, delisting of nicotine gum, patches and lozenges. With the generator improvements rule, this was dated as of January 21st. In blue are all the states that have adopted this new rule, and by July of 2022, the rest of the states should come on board for that. And what it says in the generator improvements rule is, you got to make your waste determination on site. Once you know your generator classification, you have to manage it accordingly, package your containers with the appropriate labeling, store your items properly, and if you do have an episodic event, you can now have more than one, but you just have to let the DNR know. And if you're a large quantity generator, you have to have a contingency plan. For operating under subpart P, just as a recap, you no longer have to count your monthly hazardous waste pharmaceuticals in your total numbers. You can mix your P waste in with your non-hazardous waste, and other hazardous waste still subject to 262 subpart P, where you have to dispose of it properly. Large and small quantity generators are required to opt in, where VSQGs can choose to opt in. If you're a VSQG that's part of a larger, like an affiliate, you can send your items over to them if they're part of subpart P and become part of their numbers. If you have, how many have reverse distributors come to your facility? Do you know? Reverse distributors come and they help determine if you can get credit for expired pharmaceuticals, so those no longer become part of your waste stream. Well, it used to be that reverse distributors would come and just take a box and throw everything in there and say, I'm going to sort it out at my site. Well, now the new rule says you have to make that determination on site. And the segregation must be done at the facility. And what's considered as credible that they can take away, if it's original manufacturer packaging, if it's undispensed or and it's unexpired less than 1 year past the expiration date. They can't take things away like broken or leaking containers if it's been repackaged or expired, or if it's an investigational new drug. What happens is that if it's got a reasonable expectation, the reverse distributor will either donate it, sell it, and you'll receive money for it. They could recycle it or repair it. But if it doesn't have a reasonable expectation for credit, it will go right to the treatment facility. Can't be sewered and can't be thrown away. For shipments of hazardous pharmaceutical, anything that's potentially credible, when the reverse distributor takes it away, they have to give you a confirmation of delivery. And on the manifest, because it's drugs, the manifest must have this on their manifest PHRM for pharmaceuticals. The sewer prohibition, that says that you cannot flush hazardous waste pharmaceuticals down the drain. And these particular drugs have to be put in the cactus sink first. They're DEA controlled substances. I don't know if you've ever seen the fentanyl spray, testosterone gels. These are things, Valium. You'll see these at your facility. You want to make sure that they get treated first to be made non-recoverable before they're put into the black container. Okay, there's empty container law now too that says that, because many people ask, what's an empty container? When is it empty? Well, the residues that are left over in that container are no longer regulated as hazardous waste if they're empty, except if it's a P-listed waste. All the others can be considered okay. It's, if you could flip to the next slide. If it's a syringe and you fully depress the container, if you remove the contents out of a bottle, if you've squeezed everything you can out of the IV bag, then it's considered empty. And as far as the nicotine amendment goes, used to be that if you had a nicotine patch that somebody had on, we recommend that you put that in the black bin. We still recommend it because you never know if someone just throws that in the trash and a little kid comes along and puts it on his arm, you're going to have a very sick kid. So it's not that much. We would still recommend doing it, but the EPA said, okay, those are no longer, patches, wrappers, gums, lozenges are no longer considered acute hazardous waste. What is considered acute waste is the e-liquids, e-juice, e-cigarettes. So if you have any of those that you need to dispose of, those are considered a P waste. Okay, now a review. You might have this on the bottom of your test. You can pour hazardous liquids down the drain or dilute them so they are no longer hazardous. False. Dual waste, which is a mix of biohazard and hazardous, is the most expensive waste to dispose of.
True.
True. If it happens, it's got to be called dual waste. Match the following. What's considered a delisted waste? Is it a chemo, acute haz, or ignitable corrosive?
Ignitable corrosive.
Right. A U-listed waste? That is a chemo drug. And a P-listed waste, those are the real nasties. Those are acutely hazardous. Controlled substances like Oxycontin can be thrown in the hazardous waste container. That's false. Needs to be put in that cactus sink first. Get rid of it. It's important to log the inspection of weekly containers for any leaks and spills and make sure the lids are closed on them. And the answer is, okay, thank you. You remembered. Things like empty plastic containers, wrappers, or empty IV bags can go in the trash, except if the container held a P-listed pharmaceutical. Then it must go in the hazardous bin.
True.
True. When a container is full in the satellite accumulation area, it must be moved within 5 days.
False. 3.
False. Had to throw a tricky one in there. How many days is it? 3 days. That's right. Okay, good. You guys did well.